My name is Mrs. Vance. Elora Vance. There are moments in life that shatter your world so completely, you forget how to breathe. For me, that moment wasn't just standing at the edge of my beautiful little girl's grave, saying a goodbye no mother should ever have to say. It was the devastating discovery that while I was burying a piece of my soul in the freezing rain, the man who promised to protect us was relaxing on a sun-drenched beach, living a carefully constructed lie. Before I share the details of my journey, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to you. Thank you. Thank you for pausing your day, for opening your heart, and for giving me your most precious gift, your time, to listen to my story. I know that I am not the only one who has felt broken. Many of you watching this right now carry your own hidden scars, your own silent battles with grief, betrayal, or profound loss. I want you to know that you are not alone. I want my story to remind you that no matter how deep the betrayal, and no matter how suffocating the darkness feels right now, you have an incredible, unbreakable strength inside you. You have the power to survive the fire, to reclaim your life, and to step back into the light. If my journey of heartbreak, justice, and ultimate healing resonates with you today, please consider subscribing to this channel, Queen's Revenge. Your humble support means the world to me, and it helps this community continue to share stories that prove love and resilience will always have the final word. Now let me tell you how my nightmare began, and how I finally woke up. The day we buried my daughter, Grace, the world was painted in a suffocating palette of muted grays. The sky hung low, a heavy canopy of bruised clouds that seemed to mirror the unbearable, crushing weight pressing down on my chest. I stood at the edge of the freshly dug earth, my body rigid, a hollow shell entirely emptied of life. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and the cloying sweetness of white lilies, a fragrance that would forever be tethered to the worst day of my existence. Around me, a sea of black umbrellas and bowed heads formed a perimeter of mourning. Friends, extended family, and acquaintances murmur their condolences, their voices blending into a meaningless, droning hum that barely penetrated the thick haze of my grief. They offered gentle touches to my shoulder and whispered prayers that fell on deaf ears. My little girl, my sweet, vibrant Grace, was gone, and as the polished wooden casket was slowly lowered into the ground, I felt a vital piece of my own soul being buried right alongside her. But above the suffocating sorrow, above the rhythmic thud of earth hitting the casket lid, one glaring reality dominated my consciousness, the agonizingly empty space immediately to my left. Marcus wasn't there. The man I had married, the man who had held my hand in the delivery room when Grace took her very first breath, was entirely absent as she took her last. I could feel the questioning stares of the attendees, the silent judgments and whispered inquiries rippling through the crowd. I saw the way my mother-in-law kept glancing at the cemetery gates, her face pinched in a mixture of embarrassment and sorrow. I saw the pity in my best friend's eyes. Where is her husband? How could a father not be here? They didn't dare ask me directly, offering instead a pitying silence that burned like acid. I had no answers to give them, only the bitter, jagged pill of his abandonment. Over the last grueling months of Grace's illness, as sterile hospital rooms became our second home and the relentless beeping of monitors our terrible lullaby, Marcus had steadily faded from our lives like a ghost. He cited the crushing demands of his career, the supposed necessity of keeping our family financially afloat while the exorbitant medical bills mounted. Business trips and late-night meetings became his impenetrable shield against the agonizing reality of our dying child. I had been too consumed by my desperate, daily fight to save her to truly interrogate his absence. I was too exhausted by the chemotherapy schedules and the midnight fevers to fight with him about his constant travel. But today of all days, his absence wasn't just a failure of partnership, it was a profound, unforgivable desecration of our daughter's memory. When the final prayer was spoken, and the crowd began to slowly disperse, returning to their cars and their unbroken, ordinary lives, a terrifying numbness washed over me. It was a dark, merciful anesthesia, shutting down my nerve endings so I wouldn't simply collapse into the dirt and refuse to get up. I thanked the pastor with a voice that sounded like it belonged to a stranger, hollow and raspy, stripped of all emotion. I navigated the uneven terrain of the cemetery alone, my black heels sinking slightly into the wet grass, desperate to escape the suffocating blanket of their sympathetic gazes. I just needed to be alone. I needed to scream until my throat bled, or perhaps simply stop breathing for a while. Reaching my car parked at the edge of the cemetery gates, I practically fell into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut and sealing myself inside. The silence in the cabin was absolute, heavy, and ringing in my ears. I gripped the cold leather steering wheel, bowing my head as the first jagged, uncontrollable sob tore its way up my throat. Just as the dam was about to break, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The sudden, sharp vibration startled me. For a fleeting, pathetic fraction of a second, a foolish hope flared in my chest. It's Marcus, I thought. He's finally calling. He's stranded at an airport. He missed a connection. He's weeping in a hotel room somewhere, absolutely destroyed by the fact that he missed his only daughter's funeral. My hands shook violently as I fumbled to retrieve the device, my tear-blurred eyes squinting at the glowing screen. It was a text message, not a missed call, not a frantic voicemail, just a few typed words. I wiped my eyes with the back of my trembling hand, bracing myself for the apologies, the excuses, the frantic grief I fully expected to bleed through the digital text. Instead, the words staring back at me were casual, dismissive, utterly detached. Important meeting. I'll call you later. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Important meeting. I'll call you later. No mention of Grace. No acknowledgement of the harrowing day I had just endured. It was the kind of text you send when you are running late for a casual dinner reservation, not when you are missing the burial of your child. The sheer audacity, the chilling callousness of those 7 words made the blood in my veins run icy cold. But it wasn't just the message that caught my attention. It was the tiny, seemingly insignificant detail hovering just beneath the text bubble, the automated location tag his phone had attached to the SMS. The tag didn't read Chicago, or New York, or any of the bustling corporate hubs he frequented. It didn't belong to a conference center or a downtown office building. It read, the Azure Sands Luxury Resort and Spa, St. Bart's. I blinked, the words refusing to change, the harsh light of the screen burning the truth into my retinas. My thumb hovered over the screen, and I tapped the location, bringing up a map. A tiny red pin rested squarely over a 5-star, beachfront paradise in the Caribbean. My vision swam, but not with tears of grief. The dark, numbing sorrow that had paralyzed me moments before instantly evaporated, incinerated by a sudden, blinding flash of pure, unadulterated rage. He wasn't in a boardroom negotiating a contract to save our family. He wasn't trapped in a transit lounge. He wasn't mourning in solitude, broken by the loss of his child. While I stood in the freezing, damp earth, watching our little girl descend into the dark, Marcus was relaxing in paradise. My fingers tightened around the phone until the plastic case groaned under the pressure. The memories of his recent distance, the vague excuses, the sudden essential trips, they all snapped into a new, sickening focus. He had run. He had cowardly left me to hold our dying daughter's hand, to bear the crushing weight of her passing, and to endure the agony of her funeral entirely alone, while he basked in the sun with a cocktail in his hand. A primal, feral heat bloomed in my chest, traveling up my throat and settling behind my eyes like a burning coal. The devastated, weeping mother vanished in the confines of that cramped car. In her place, a cold, calculating fury took root. If Marcus thought he could abandon us, betray our daughter's memory, and continue living his perfect, unbothered life, he was fatally mistaken. I wiped my face, the tears completely dry. The time for mourning was over. The nightmare was just beginning, but this time, he would be the one trapped inside it. The drive home from the cemetery was a blur of gray asphalt and the monotonous rhythm of the windshield wipers pushing away a sudden, biting drizzle. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before me not as a sanctuary, but as a hollowed-out mausoleum. I turned the key in the lock, the mechanical click echoing too loudly in the suffocating stillness that rushed out to greet me. 4 months. This house had been a battlefield of beeping medical equipment, hushed consultations, and the frantic, desperate energy of keeping our daughter alive. Now the silence was absolute, heavy, and ringing with finality. The air felt stale, trapped in the amber of a life that no longer existed. I took off my damp coat, my movements stiff and mechanical, and walked down the hallway. My eyes fixed straight ahead, violently willing my peripheral vision to blur as I passed Grace's bedroom door. It was closed, just as I had left it this morning. Behind that white painted would lay her neatly arranged stuffed animals, her favorite lavender-scented blanket folded at the foot of the bed, and a universe of memories I was entirely too fragile to face. The urge to slide down the wall, press my face against the floorboards, and scream until my vocal cords shredded was a physical weight pressing against the back of my knees. But the image of that location tag, the Azure Sands Luxury Resort and Spa, flashed behind my eyelids like a warning siren. The weeping, shattered mother had been buried alongside Grace. The woman standing in the hallway was something else entirely. She was made of ice and jagged glass. I bypassed the living room and marched straight into Marcus's home office. The room smelled faintly of his expensive cedarwood cologne, a scent that suddenly made my stomach churn with bile. I sat down at his heavy oak desk, flipped open my laptop, and stared at the glowing screen. A cold, surgical determination guided my fingers as I brought up our joint banking portals. For the past year, I had been the one drowning in the minutiae of Grace's care, leaving Marcus to handle the mounting financial logistics. He had constantly complained about the strain, about liquidating assets, and taking on debt to afford her out-of-network specialists and specialized treatments. I had believed every single lie that fell from his mouth. I downloaded the past 12 months of statements, my eyes scanning the endless rows of digital numbers. At first glance, it looked like the ledger of a family in medical crisis. There were massive withdrawals labeled with generic terms: medical escrow, copay disbursement, specialist retainer. But as I cross-referenced the dates with the physical hospital bills stacked in my filing cabinet, the sickening discrepancy began to reveal itself. The dates didn't align. The hospital wasn't receiving these massive transfers. I dug deeper, navigating to a secondary banking app one knew Marcus kept for his freelance consulting. It took me 3 tries to guess his password, a predictable variation of our wedding anniversary, a cruel irony that made my jaw clench. When the screen loaded, the dam broke. The money wasn't going to oncologists or pediatric specialists. It was being funneled into a hidden credit card account. My fingers flew across the keyboard, hacking my way into his synchronized email account that he had carelessly left logged in on our shared home network. I searched for the credit card's last 4 digits, and a cascade of electronic receipts flooded the inbox. They were not medical bills. They were invoices for opulence. 5-star hotel reservations in Paris, Aspen, and Miami. Charges for omakase dinners that cost more than Grace's weekly physical therapy sessions. Receipts for La Mer skincare. Thousands of dollars dropped at high-end boutiques and extravagant couples spa retreats. I stared at a receipt for a diamond tennis bracelet purchased 3 days after Grace was admitted to the ICU with a collapsed lung. I vividly remember that night. I had slept in a plastic chair beside her bed, praying to a god I wasn't sure I believed in, while Marcus claimed he had to fly to London to secure a desperately needed client retainer. He hadn't been securing our future. He had been buying jewelry. But money only told half the story. The receipts begged a devastating question. Who was wearing the bracelet? Who was eating the dinners? I opened a new tab and pulled up his social media. His public profile was a masterclass in manipulation. Carefully curated posts about the hardships of being a father to a sick child, generic inspirational quotes, and requests for prayers that garnered hundreds of sympathetic comments from our friends. It made me want to vomit. But money leaves a trail, and ego leaves a billboard. I didn't look at his posts. I looked at his likes and his recent follows. I sifted through the digital crowd until a recurring face caught my eye. Her name was Lily. She was young, perhaps 10 years my junior, with a cascade of effortless blonde hair and the glowing, unblemished skin of someone who had never known a day of true, soul-crushing tragedy. Her Instagram profile was public. I clicked on it, and the remaining breath was knocked violently from my lungs. It was a vibrant, sickeningly bright chronicle of their hidden life. There were photos of them clinking crystal champagne flutes on a yacht, their faces pressed together, flushed with alcohol and laughter. There was a candid shot of Marcus sleeping in a massive, plush hotel bed, the caption reading, "My sleepy prince taking a break from saving the world." My vision blurred with red-hot fury. I scrolled further, matching the dates of her posts to the days of Marcus's supposed business trips. When Grace had her second round of chemotherapy, Marcus and Lily were wine tasting in Napa. When I was begging the doctors to try one last experimental drug, Marcus was kissing Lily's cheek on a ski lift in Colorado. And then, I found the most recent post, uploaded just hours ago. A picture of Lily in a white bikini, lounging against an infinity pool that spilled out into the turquoise Caribbean Sea. In the background, out of focus but unmistakably him, was Marcus, holding 2 tropical drinks. The location tag was the final, devastating nail in the coffin, the Azure Sands Luxury Resort and Spa, St. Bart's. I pushed the laptop away, my chest heaving as if I had sprinted miles through freezing air. The scope of his betrayal was so massive, so profoundly evil, that my brain struggled to process the geometry of it. He hadn't just been weak. He hadn't just cracked under the pressure of having a dying child and sought a momentary escape. It was calculated, prolonged, and parasitic. He had systematically drained the funds that could have paid for better care, for clinical trials, for anything that might have given our daughter a fighting chance. He had stolen Grace's future, literally robbing his dying child, to fund a lavish, sickening fantasy with his mistress. I sat in the glow of the computer screen as the shadows in the office lengthened and the house grew dark. The silence of the empty rooms no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a blank canvas. The grief that had threatened to drown me only hours ago at the cemetery had been completely incinerated, replaced by a crystalline, diamond-hard resolve. Marcus thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he could walk away from the wreckage of our family completely unscathed, his pockets full and his new life waiting in the sun. The sun rose the next morning, an offensive, blindingly bright intrusion into a house that should have remained shrouded in eternal mourning. I hadn't slept a single second. My eyes burned, scratchy with exhaustion, but my mind was hypervigilant, humming with a toxic, electric energy. I knew that the screenshots and credit card statements I had pulled from our home network the night before were a devastating start, but they were not enough. Marcus was a corporate snake, a silver-tongued master of spin, deflection, and gaslighting. If I confronted him with my amateur digital sleuthing, he would manipulate the narrative. He would claim he had been hacked, or that Lily was a demanding high-net-worth client, or that the drained accounts were tied up in complex, illiquid investments he couldn't easily explain to a layman. I needed a weapon he couldn't charm his way out of. I needed bulletproof, legally binding, undeniable proof. I spent the early hours of the morning scouring the darker, quieter corners of the internet for a private investigator. I bypassed the flashy agencies with polished websites and focused on those promising absolute discretion and ruthlessness. I found a woman named Eleanor. Her online presence was minimal, her reviews sparse but intensely reverent, praising her thoroughness and ironclad confidentiality. I called her at exactly 8 o'clock, my voice betraying none of the internal tremors shaking my ribcage. When we met 2 hours later in a nondescript, dimly lit coffee shop across town, she didn't offer empty platitudes or pitying glances at my pale, drawn face. The coffee shop was a subterranean haunt, smelling of burnt espresso and damp wool. Rain lashed against the high, narrow windows at street level, casting frantic, watery shadows across the floor. Eleanor was sharp-eyed, angular, and strictly professional, sliding a small leather notebook onto the scratched wooden table. I handed her a thick manila envelope containing my printed findings, the offshore resort tags, Lily's Instagram handle, and the gutted remnants of Grace's medical escrow. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away the bleeding mother and presenting only the wronged wife. I need the rest of the iceberg, I told her, my fingers hovering over the envelope. Find every penny, every lie, and every secret he thinks he's successfully buried. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I answered incoming condolence texts with polite, robotic gratitude. I finalized the excruciating paperwork for Grace's granite headstone. And I waited, the rage simmering just beneath my skin. When Eleanor finally summoned me to her austere, windowless office on the 4th day, the air in the room felt heavily charged. She sat behind a massive steel desk, a thick, meticulously tabbed binder resting squarely between us. Your husband has been very busy, but he is fundamentally arrogant, Eleanor began, her voice devoid of inflection. And arrogance always leaves a very messy paper trail. She opened the binder. The first few pages confirmed the horrific details I already knew, the timeline of the affair, the luxurious getaways disguised as emergency business trips, the methodical draining of our joint checking. But as Eleanor flipped to the middle section, the narrative mutated from pathetic infidelity into massive, calculated fraud. "He isn't just stealing from your family's medical funds," Eleanor stated, tapping a manicured fingernail against a complex, color-coded spreadsheet. "He's stealing from his firm, actively and aggressively." My breath hitched in my throat. Eleanor laid out the anatomy of a staggering embezzlement scheme. Marcus had created a network of phantom vendors and shell LLCs, funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of his company's revenue into offshore accounts. I stared at the fake letterheads. Empty, fictitious entities designed solely to drain his employer's coffers. He had falsified signatures, fabricated project deliverables, and routed the stolen corporate capital through a dizzying maze of wire transfers. He was playing a high-stakes game of corporate Russian roulette, fueled by the intoxicating high of his double life. He had been doctoring invoices for months, siphoning capital to maintain the illusion of infinite wealth for Lily, while simultaneously bleeding his own daughter's medical reserves dry to cover his tracks at home. It was a spectacular house of cards, built entirely on profound sociopathy and corporate theft. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. If his board of directors found out, he wouldn't just be fired, he would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary. But Eleanor wasn't finished. The worst was yet to come. She slid a final, stapled packet of intercepted communications across the desk. "He's planning a permanent exit," she said quietly. I picked up the pages. They were printed emails exchanged between Marcus and Lily, sent from a hidden encrypted burner account Eleanor had managed to crack. I read the words, the black ink swimming fiercely before my eyes. They were discussing purchasing luxury real estate in Costa Rica, researching expatriate banking laws, and finalizing the logistics of a one-way move. But the true, killing blow was a message Marcus had sent on the very day Grace's pediatric oncologist had sat us down in a sterile room and told us there was nothing more they could do. "Just hold on a little longer, babe," he had written to Lily. "Once everything is finalized here, we'll sell the house. We'll leave this depressing nightmare behind. We'll never have to look back. She'll never see it coming, and then it's just you and me in the sun." The paper crinkled violently in my tightening grip, my knuckles turning bone white. The words, "this depressing nightmare," echoed in my skull. That was how he summarized our daughter's brave, agonizing battle against cancer. That was how he viewed the late nights holding her frail body, the tears, the desperate, pleading prayers. A logistical hurdle, an inconvenience delaying his permanent vacation. He had been waiting for Grace to die. He had been calculating the timeline of her suffering, viewing the tragic end of our little girl's life not as a catastrophic heartbreak, but as a convenient finish line for his domestic obligations. He intended to let me bury our child entirely alone, blindside me with a rapid liquidation of our remaining assets, and vanish into a tropical paradise with his mistress, erasing my existence entirely. I sat perfectly still in the sterile chill of the investigator's office, the heavy binder of his sins resting under my palms. The anger that had ignited in my car outside the cemetery days ago had fundamentally evolved. It was no longer a wild, thrashing flame. It had compressed into something dense, cold, and heavy as dark matter. I looked up at Eleanor, sliding a cashier's check across the desk to cover her exorbitant, entirely justified fee. A simple divorce, arguing over alimony and mediation, splitting the remaining living room furniture, weeping in front of a judge, was utterly, laughably inadequate. Divorce was a civilized process for civilized people whose marriages had simply run their course. It was far too small a word for what I required. Marcus had systematically dismantled my universe. He had placed a price tag on my dying child's final breaths to fund his tropical escape. I wasn't going to serve him with papers. I was going to detonate his reality. I was going to systematically, brutally, and publicly dismantle the entire empire of lies he had built, and I would not stop until he was standing in the ashes, possessing absolutely nothing. The silence of the house had become my most trusted accomplice. Armed with the heavy, meticulously organized binder Eleanor had provided, I transformed our formal dining room table into a war room. The polished mahogany surface, where we had once shared Thanksgiving dinners and celebrated his corporate promotions, was now completely obscured beneath a tidal wave of indictments. I worked with the sterile, unfeeling precision of a surgeon prepping for an amputation. I purchased heavy, black leather portfolios, the exact kind Marcus utilized for his most important board meetings, and began transferring the evidence of his destruction. In the first portfolio, I placed the financial ruin. I perfectly aligned the glossy printouts of his offshore bank accounts, the falsified corporate invoices, and the staggering wire transfers that unequivocally proved his embezzlement. The numbers were astronomical, a damning, irrefutable ledger of a man who had sold his soul to fund an opulent illusion. In the second portfolio, I curated the personal betrayal. I printed the high-resolution images Eleanor had pulled from Lily's social media and Marcus's hidden cloud drives. I stared at the glossy paper, my thumb tracing the edge of a photograph where Marcus was lifting Lily out of a turquoise infinity pool, his head thrown back in jubilant, carefree laughter. It was dated the exact day Grace had lost her hair to the second agonizing round of chemotherapy. I slipped the photo into a clear plastic sleeve. Every piece of paper was a poisoned dart, perfectly sharpened and ready to be deployed. I wasn't just building a legal case, I was constructing a guillotine. But financial ruin and infidelity were clinical. They appealed to the mind, to the cold letter of the law, to the board of directors. To truly break Marcus, to ensure the devastation reached the darkest, most shriveled corners of whatever heart he had left, I needed a weapon forged from pure agony. I needed him to look at exactly what he had sacrificed on the altar of his own towering narcissism. I opened my laptop, ignoring the folders containing his sordid secrets, and clicked on the external hard drive, simply labeled Grace. For the first time since the horrific morning of the funeral, I allowed myself to look at her living face. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly, the empty dining room was filled with the silvery, bell-like sound of her laughter. I gasped, the sound punching the air completely from my lungs, but I violently forced my eyes to remain open. I spent agonizing hours sifting through years of digital memories, painstakingly weaving them into a continuous timeline of the radiant, vibrant life he had so casually abandoned. I selected clips of her third birthday, her cheeks smeared with chocolate frosting as she proudly blew out the candles. I chose videos of her running through the sprinklers in the backyard, her shrieking joy cutting through the heavy summer heat. I included the quiet, beautiful moments, Grace reading a picture book with intense concentration, Grace proudly displaying a missing front tooth, Grace holding Marcus's hand on her very first day of kindergarten, looking up at him as if he hung the moon. I expertly edited the footage, cutting away the sterile hospital rooms, the 4 drips, the pale skin, and the hollow-eyed ghost she had become at the cruel end. I only showed the light. I wanted the contrast to completely blind him. I set the montage to play in a continuous loop, a haunting, unbroken testament to a beautiful child who deserved a father who actually stayed. By the time I exported the final video file to a sleek silver flash drive, my face was wet with tears, but my internal resolve had dropped to absolute zero. The emotional payload was complete. Now, I needed to lure the monster out of his labyrinth. I couldn't confront him here, in the house where Grace had suffered and died. The walls were too sacred, too saturated with her fading memory, to be sullied by his inevitable screaming, denial, and pathetic groveling. I needed isolated ground, a place where he felt entirely in control, a place he associated with our past wealth and untarnished status. The coastal vacation home, a sprawling, glass-fronted property perched on a rocky cliffside 2 hours north, was perfect. It was currently empty, locked up for the season, sitting in splendid, atmospheric isolation above the crashing, violent waves of the Atlantic. It was a stage perfectly designed for a tragedy. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his contact name. To catch a predator, you have to play the wounded prey. I had to swallow the bitter bile rising in my throat and channel the desperate, weeping widow he fully expected me to be. I typed slowly, agonizing over every carefully chosen word to ensure the tone was suitably pathetic and pliable. Marcus, I wrote, the house is too quiet. I can't breathe in these rooms without her. I know we've been distant, and I know the stress of the last year broke us. But I miss you. I need you. Can we please go up to the Cliff House this weekend? Just the 2 of us. I need some time to reconnect and figure out how we survive this. I read the text twice. It was a masterpiece of subservient desperation. It fed his monumental ego, validated his control over my emotions, and offered absolutely no hint of the venom coursing through my veins. I pressed send, dropping the phone onto the table as if it had burned my flesh. I didn't have to wait long. Marcus was a creature of predictable, arrogant habit. Within 15 minutes, the screen illuminated with his incoming reply. Of course, sweetheart. I've been drowning in work, but you're right. We need this. I'll clear my schedule. I'll meet you there Friday evening. I love you. I stared at those 3 final words, a cold, humorless smile stretching tightly across my face. I love you. The ultimate, sickening lie, typed casually between embezzling corporate funds and booking flights with his mistress. He had accepted the invitation with the breezy confidence of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. He envisioned a weekend of easily manipulated tears, where he could play the comforting, aggrieved husband before inevitably excusing himself to take urgent business calls from Lily. He thought he was walking into a quiet sanctuary to pacify a broken, clueless woman. He was entirely, blissfully unaware that he was stepping directly into an emotional slaughterhouse. I gathered the heavy leather portfolios and the silver flash drive, placing them carefully into the bottom of my overnight bag. The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and the arrogant architect of my ruin was willingly driving himself straight toward the cliff's edge. The Atlantic Ocean crashed violently against the jagged rocks below our cliffside retreat, a furious, rhythmic pounding that perfectly matched the adrenaline surging through my veins. I sat in the absolute center of the sprawling, glass-fronted living room, a solitary figure engulfed by the dying afternoon light that cast long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood floor. The heavy black leather portfolios rested innocuously on the polished expanse of the dining table, waiting patiently like coiled vipers in the brush. The house was dead quiet, save for the howling of the coastal wind rattling the window panes. At precisely 6 o'clock, the distinct crunch of tires on gravel announced his arrival. I didn't move. I simply watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a sleek black sedan pulled to a smooth stop in the driveway. Marcus stepped out of the driver's side, stretching his arms high above his head, inhaling the salty sea air with a look of profound satisfaction. He was wearing a casually unbuttoned white linen shirt and tailored slacks, his skin glowing with a fresh, golden tan that screamed of Caribbean sunshine, not the fluorescent, soul-sucking lighting of a hospital waiting room. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a small, expensive leather weekender bag, slinging it effortlessly over his shoulder. He exuded the breezy, carefree energy of a wealthy man arriving for a romantic, restorative getaway. He walked toward the front door with a light, confident stride. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had flawlessly executed the perfect crime, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was walking straight onto the gallows. The front door clicked open, and he stepped into the foyer, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl with a familiar, sickeningly domestic clatter that made my teeth grind together. "Sweetheart, I'm here." His voice echoed down the hallway, smooth, rich, and heavily laden with a practiced, theatrical sorrow. He rounded the corner into the living room, a look of profound, calculated sympathy already painted meticulously across his handsome features. He walked directly toward me, his arms extended to offer an embrace I would rather burn alive than accept. I didn't stand up. I remained perfectly seated at the head of the long table, my hands folded rigidly over the leather portfolios. He paused halfway across the room, his arms dropping slightly to his sides, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking his sorrowful mask. "Are you okay? You look so cold," he murmured, pulling out the heavy wooden chair opposite me and sitting down. He reached across the wide expanse of the table, attempting to cover my frozen hands with his warm, tanned fingers. "I am so incredibly sorry about this week. The guilt of being trapped in that boardroom negotiating while you were burying our little girl, it's absolutely destroying me. But I'm here now. We'll get through this terrible grief together. I promise you." I slowly pulled my hands out from under his, leaving his fingers resting awkwardly on the empty wood. My voice, when I finally spoke, was entirely devoid of any human warmth. It was the absolute zero of the universe, sharp and slicing. "You have a beautiful tan for a man who has spent the last week locked in a Chicago boardroom, Marcus." He blinked, a nervous, patronizing chuckle escaping his throat. "What?" "Oh, the tan. I had to fly down to Miami for a quick client dinner right after the negotiations wrapped up. The sundown there is. I didn't let him finish the lie. I unzipped the first portfolio, the harsh, metallic sound slicing cleanly through the quiet room. I pulled out the first glossy sheet of paper, the credit card statement from the Azure Sands Resort and Spa, complete with the date, the location tag, and the itemized charges for couples' sea salt massages and vintage champagne. I slid it across the smooth table. It stopped mere inches from his fingertips. A client dinner, I echoed, my tone dead and flat. In St. Bart's. On the exact day we lowered Grace into the ground. Marcus stared down at the paper, the golden warmth visibly draining from his face, leaving behind a sickly, ashen pallor. His mouth opened and closed, stammering for a foothold in a reality that was rapidly collapsing beneath him. I don't know where you got this. This is a massive misunderstanding. It's a corporate expense my assistant booked. I didn't blink. I reached into the portfolio again. Slide. The falsified invoices from his phantom LLCs hit the table. Slide. The offshore wire transfer confirmations followed. Slide. The intercepted emails outlining his explicit plan to flee the country, liquidate our assets, and leave me completely bankrupt. They formed a neat, devastating grid of absolute ruin across the mahogany wood. Corporate expenses, I repeated, watching the arrogant, carefree man begin to hyperventilate. His chest heaved against the linen shirt, his eyes darting frantically across the documents, the sheer, impossible volume of my knowledge entirely paralyzing him. Then, I unzipped the second portfolio. I took the high-resolution photograph of him lifting Lily out of the turquoise infinity pool, her blonde hair wet against her shoulders, his face split in a joyous, carefree grin. I dropped it dead center on the table, right on top of his fake corporate invoices. Did you tell Lily she was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet paid for by your dying daughter's medical fund? Or did you just tell her you were a very successful, generous businessman? Stop, he gasped, his voice cracking violently. The confident linen shirt suddenly looked terribly thin and pathetic against his trembling, cowering shoulders. Please, just let me explain to you. I was terrified. The hospital, the sickness, the dying. I broke. I couldn't handle watching her fade away. I just needed an escape, a way to cope with the nightmare. I stood up so abruptly my heavy wooden chair screeched loudly against the floorboards, instantly silencing his pathetic, whimpering excuses. I picked up the small remote control resting near my elbow and pressed the power button. The massive flat-screen television, mounted above the stone fireplace, flared to life. The room was instantly flooded with the silvery, bell-like laughter of our daughter. On the screen, Grace was 3 years old, spinning in a yellow summer dress in our old backyard, her eyes bright and entirely unclouded by pain. She ran toward the camera, throwing her little arms around Marcus's legs, screaming, "Daddy! I love you, Daddy!" Marcus flinched violently, physically recoiling as if he had been struck in the jaw by an invisible fist. He covered his mouth with both of his hands, a guttural, wretched sob tearing from the back of his throat as the video montage continued to play. Birthdays, holidays, the pure, radiant light of a child he had brutally abandoned. He was forced to stare directly into the eyes of the daughter he had sacrificed for a cheap, tropical affair. His smug facade didn't just crumble, it was utterly pulverized into dust. He slid out of his chair, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, weeping hysterically, begging the screen, begging me, begging a God he had entirely ignored for the past year. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, standing tall over his trembling, pathetic form huddled on the floor. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clean, intoxicating satisfaction of an executioner wiping the blood from the blade. You wanted an escape from the nightmare, Marcus, I said, my voice slicing clearly through his wailing sobs. So I gave you one. I didn't just print these documents to secure a favorable divorce settlement. 3 hours ago, I forwarded the entire financial dossier, every fake invoice, every wire transfer, every offshore account, and every proof of embezzlement, to your board of directors, the IRS, and the federal authorities. They know everything. You are going to federal prison. He froze, his tear-streaked face snapping up to look at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. The breath hitched painfully in his chest, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and wild like a trapped animal realizing the steel cage was permanently locked. He reached out, his hand shaking violently, trying to grasp the hem of my coat in a desperate plea for mercy. No, please, you can't. My career, my life. I took a deliberate step back, letting his hand grasp nothing but empty air. Your life ended the exact moment you decided to let Grace die without her father, I said softly, the absolute finality of the words ringing in the air. I turned my back on the weeping, ruined man sobbing on the floorboards. I picked up my car keys from the counter and walked out the front door, stepping out into the freezing, punishing coastal wind, leaving him entirely alone to drown in the spectacular, inescapable wreckage of his own making. The drive back to the city was a masterclass in emotional detachment. The coastal storm that had battered the vacation home followed me down the winding highway, sheets of torrential rain lashing against my windshield in violent, erratic waves. The rhythmic, frantic sweeping of the wipers was the only sound inside the dark cabin of my car. I drove with both hands gripping the leather steering wheel, my posture straight, my breathing perfectly even. The weeping, shattered woman who had stood at the edge of Grace's grave was a distant memory, buried under the heavy, cold armor of pure, unadulterated vengeance. I had left Marcus kneeling on the hardwood floor of our cliffside retreat, drowning in the echoing laughter of the daughter he had abandoned, surrounded by the paper debris of his entirely fabricated life. But the confrontation was merely the overture. The true symphony of his destruction was about to begin. When I finally stepped through the front door of my silent, empty house, I didn't bother taking off my damp coat or turning on the hallway lights. I walked with absolute, singular purpose straight into the kitchen and opened my laptop on the granite island. The screen cast a harsh, bluish glow across my face in the darkness. My email client was already open, the draft I had prepared days ago waiting patiently for my final command. The recipient list was a meticulously curated directory of Marcus's entire universe. In the primary, to field set the email addresses of his company's chief executive officer, the entire board of directors, the head of human resources, and the chief financial officer. In the BCC field, I had ruthlessly inputted every single person of consequence in his personal sphere. His parents, his siblings, his college fraternity brothers, the neighbors who had brought us pitying casseroles, and the wealthy country club acquaintances he so desperately sought to impress. Attached to the email was a single, compressed digital folder. It contained Eleanor's entire investigative opus. The offshore bank statements, the fraudulent vendor invoices, the undeniable proof of his staggering corporate embezzlement, and the intercepted communications proving he intended to flee the country with stolen capital. I also included a select few photographs of him and Lily living in tropical luxury, clearly time-stamped with the exact dates of Grace's chemotherapy sessions and her eventual funeral. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained no hysterical rants, no emotional pleas, and no context. It simply read, "For your immediate review." I stared at the cursor hovering over the send button. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I thought about the gravity of what I was about to do. I was about to press a button that would entirely obliterate a human being's existence. It would strip him of his wealth, his freedom, his social standing, and his reputation. It was a digital nuclear strike from which there would be absolutely zero possibility of recovery. I thought of Grace's pale, trusting face, and the empty space beside me at the cemetery. My finger pushed down on the trackpad. With a soft, electronic whoosh, the email vanished from my outbox. The bomb was entirely out of my hands. The fallout was not gradual, it was immediate, catastrophic, and deeply satisfying. It began at exactly 6 a.m. with a frantic, vibrating hum from my phone left on the kitchen counter. Then, it became a continuous, unrelenting cascade of notifications. The social implosion was visceral. Text messages flooded my screen from friends and family, their words bleeding with shock, horror, and profound revulsion. I had no idea. He is a monster. I am so incredibly sorry. I feel sick to my stomach. The carefully cultivated, saintly image Marcus had projected to the world, the heartbroken, hard-working father valiantly trying to save his family, evaporated in a matter of hours. The people who had once admired him now viewed him as a radioactive parasite. He was socially excommunicated before the sun had even fully risen. By noon, the professional implosion caught up to the personal one. Eleanor, ever the consummate professional, called me from her encrypted line to provide the real-time casualty report. "It is a bloodbath," she stated, her usually stoic voice tinged with a dark amusement. The board convened an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. They have officially frozen his corporate access, locked down his physical office, and revoked his building security clearance. His company's legal team is currently tearing his department apart, and from what my internal sources tell me, they are entirely panicked. You didn't just give them smoke, you handed them the arsonist holding the gasoline. The final confirmation of his absolute ruin came the following afternoon. My phone rang, displaying an unknown local number. I answered, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Is this Mrs. Vance?" A deep, gravelly voice inquired. "Speaking. This is Detective Reynolds with the city's Financial Crimes Task Force. I am calling regarding the anonymous dossier our department received this morning. We have spent the last 12 hours verifying the financial routing numbers and the offshore ledgers provided in the attachment. I wanted to inform you that the evidence is overwhelmingly credible. We have bypassed the grand jury and moved straight to a judge. We have secured a warrant for your husband's arrest." I closed my eyes, a long, trembling breath escaping my lips. "Thank you, Detective." I knew exactly how a man like Marcus operated. Faced with a locked office, a frozen bank account, and a social circle that had violently turned its back on him, his arrogance would demand that he try to spin the narrative. He would march down to his corporate headquarters, demanding a meeting with the board, completely convinced he could charm his way out of a federal crime. I drove downtown, parking my car across the busy street from the towering, glass-fronted skyscraper that housed his firm. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling, sipping a cup of black coffee as I watched the revolving doors. At precisely 2 o'clock, 2 unmarked black sedans aggressively pulled up to the curb, their hidden red and blue lights flashing silently. 4 plainclothes detectives stepped out, their badges visibly clipped to their belts. Moments later, Marcus emerged from the building, escorted by 2 massive corporate security guards carrying a single cardboard box of his belongings. He looked frantic, his face pale and drawn, his designer suit looking suddenly too large for his frame. I watched through the tinted glass of my windshield as Detective Reynolds approached him. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was unmistakable. Marcus stepped back, shaking his head wildly in denial, his hands flying up defensively. The detective simply grabbed his wrist, spinning him forcefully around to face the glass lobby of his former empire. Right there, in broad daylight, surrounded by lunchtime crowds and the stunned faces of his former colleagues pressing against the glass, the cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. He was thoroughly, humiliatingly searched on the pavement, his pockets emptied, his dignity entirely stripped away. As they pushed his head down to load him into the back of the unmarked sedan, his eyes darted frantically across the street. For one brief, poetic second, his gaze locked onto my car. He couldn't see me through the tint, but he knew. The public humiliation was complete. That evening, the house was profoundly quiet. I sat in the living room, staring out the window at the deepening twilight. The silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt clean, like the air after a violent thunderstorm. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen lit up with an incoming call from the county correctional facility. I watched it ring. In my mind's eye, I could see him sitting in a cinder-block holding cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogance, desperately clutching a metal phone receiver, praying that his grieving, easily manipulated wife would answer and save him. The phone vibrated again, the automated voice system begging for a connection. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I didn't feel anger. I simply reached out, tapped the red button to decline the call, and let the beautifully dark, absolute silence reclaim my home. The spectacular, consuming wildfire of my vengeance eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a sprawling landscape of cold, gray ash. In the weeks that followed Marcus's highly publicized arrest, the media storm that had briefly swallowed our lives began to naturally recede. The sensational headlines about the disgraced, embezzling executive and his tropical mistress faded from the front pages, replaced by the relentless churn of the next corporate scandal. Marcus was denied bail, locked securely behind concrete and steel as he awaited a trial that would undoubtedly end in a lengthy federal prison sentence. His assets were frozen, his reputation was entirely pulverized, and Lily, the young woman who had so eagerly spent my dying daughter's money, had vanished into the ether the moment the FBI seized his bank accounts. I had won. I had executed a flawless, devastating retribution. I had systematically dismantled the man who had destroyed my family, leaving him with absolutely nothing. And yet, as I stood in the center of my eerily quiet living room a month later, a profound and terrifying emptiness washed over me. The intoxicating adrenaline that had fueled my sleepless nights and my calculated plotting had finally evaporated, leaving my physical body exhausted and my soul entirely hollow. I looked around the sprawling suburban house that had been the epicenter of my marriage and my tragedy. Every wall, every floorboard, was saturated with ghosts. I could see the phantom imprint of Grace's wheelchair tracks on the hallway carpet. I could hear the echoes of Marcus's fabricated excuses lingering in the foyer. The house was a museum of trauma, a monument to a life that had been brutally severed. I knew I could not survive another winter within these walls. The liquidation of our shared past was swift and merciless. I contacted a high-end real estate agent and immediately listed the coastal vacation home, the magnificent, glass-fronted cliffside property where I had served Marcus's final, devastating sentence. It sold within a week to a wealthy couple, entirely ignorant of the tears that had stained its hardwood floors. When the closing documents were signed and the massive transfer of funds cleared my private account, I didn't keep a single cent of it. It felt like blood money, tainted by his lies and his deceit. Instead, I signed a cashier's check for the entire sum and donated it anonymously to a premier pediatric oncology research center. It was the first act I had taken in months that felt genuinely clean. Shortly after, I sold the marital home, leaving behind the heavy, oppressive furniture and packing only what I could fit into a few cardboard boxes. I downsized drastically, moving into a modest, sunlit apartment on the 4th floor of a quiet, historic building across the city. It was a beautiful, airy space with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and massive bay windows that captured the golden morning light. There were no memories here. No echoes of coughing fits in the middle of the night. No lingering sense of Marcus's cedarwood cologne. It was a blank canvas, a safe harbor high above the chaotic noise of the streets below. But it was within the pristine, sun-drenched silence of this new apartment that the true, agonizing reality of my victory finally caught up with me. Revenge, I quickly learned, is a remarkably effective anesthetic. It numbs the pain by replacing it with hyper-focused, destructive action. But when the target is destroyed and the war is over, the anesthesia wears off. One Tuesday afternoon, while simply unboxing a set of coffee mugs, I found a small, stray pink sock wedged in the bottom of the cardboard. It was Grace's. I stared at the tiny piece of cotton, the pastel fabric soft against my trembling fingers, and my knees simply gave out. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor of my beautiful new kitchen, curling into a tight, agonizing fetal position, and I finally truly wept. I wept not in anger, but in the pure, unadulterated agony of a mother who has permanently lost her child. Marcus was ruined. Justice had been spectacularly served. The universe had balanced its scales, but none of it had brought Grace back. My little girl was still buried in the cold earth. I still had to wake up every single morning and face a world where her laughter did not exist. For weeks, I had used my rage to shield myself from the breathtaking magnitude of my grief. Now, stripped of my armor, the sorrow crashed over me in suffocating, oceanic waves. I spent days unable to leave the apartment, lying on the rug in the sunlight, clutching her favorite lavender blanket to my chest, letting the tears hollow me out until there was nothing left but bone and breath. It was a necessary, brutal surrender. I had to walk through the fire of mourning to reach the other side. But as the dark winter slowly thawed into a hesitant, blooming spring, a quiet realization began to take root in my heart. I could not let my story end as the bitter, vengeful widow. If I allowed the grief to entirely consume me, then Marcus's betrayal would have claimed my life as well as Grace's. I needed to build something beautiful from the ashes of my devastation. I needed to ensure that Grace's legacy was not tethered to her father's monstrous cruelty, but to the radiant, pure love she had brought into the world. Sitting by the bay window one afternoon, an idea began to take a firm, hopeful shape. I opened my laptop, the same device I had once used to orchestrate a man's ruin, and began drafting a mission statement. Within 3 months, the Grace Foundation was officially born. It started small, funded by the remaining assets I had salvaged from the divorce proceedings. The Foundation's mission was fiercely focused, to provide comprehensive financial and emotional support to families navigating the catastrophic, suffocating burden of terminal pediatric illness. I remember the agonizing stress of fighting insurance companies while holding my dying daughter's hand, and I vowed to shoulder that burden for others. We paid for experimental treatments that insurance deemed unnecessary. We covered the mortgages of parents who had to quit their jobs to sleep in hospital chairs. We provided grief counseling, meal deliveries, and mentorship programs. Channeling my pain into a fierce, protective advocacy became my salvation. Every time a hospital bill was wiped clean for a terrified family, I felt Grace's spirit glowing brightly in the room. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was actively, purposefully healing. As the foundation grew, so did my capacity to reconnect with the world I had shut out. I slowly began reaching out to old friends, the women who had respectfully given me space during the darkest days of the scandal. We met for quiet coffees that turned into long, healing dinners filled with genuine laughter, a sound I hadn't produced in over a year. The isolation that trauma demands began to fracture, letting the warmth of human connection seep back into my veins. I also found solace in a completely unexpected place, behind the lens of a camera. I enrolled in a local photography class, purchasing a vintage manual camera that required patience and absolute presence. Photography forced me to look at the world differently. It demanded that I step out of my own head and actively search for beauty. I spent my weekends walking through botanical gardens, city parks, and quiet coastal trails, capturing the fleeting, exquisite magic of ordinary moments. The golden light of a sunrise filtering through a canopy of oak trees, the genuine, unposed smile of a stranger, the delicate geometry of a falling leaf. Looking through the viewfinder, I felt as though I was seeing the world the way Grace had always seen it, full of wonder, light, and infinite possibility. My life had fundamentally transformed. The bitter, freezing storms of the past had cleared, leaving behind a resilient, hard-won peace. I had a sunlit home, a profound purpose that honored my daughter, and a heart that was slowly learning how to beat without the weight of vengeance. I believe the darkest chapters of my life were permanently closed, securely locked away in a federal prison cell. But the past, I was about to discover, rarely stays buried. The rhythm of my new life had become a beautiful, predictable sanctuary. The mornings in my 4th-floor apartment were governed by the soft brewing of coffee, the golden sunlight warming the exposed brick of my living room, and the quiet satisfaction of reviewing grant proposals for the Grace Foundation. For nearly a year, I had successfully insulated myself from the toxic, suffocating debris of my previous existence. Marcus was a ghost, a specter banished to a concrete cell in a federal penitentiary hundreds of miles away. His name had become a taboo subject among my friends, a dark chapter we had all silently agreed to close forever. I had built a fortress of purpose, charity, and hard-won peace. I truly believed the walls of my new life were entirely impenetrable. But ghosts, by their very nature, do not respect the boundaries of the living. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the past breached my defenses, arriving not with a dramatic confrontation, but in a mundane stack of envelopes pulled from my aluminum mailbox in the lobby. I was sifting through the usual assortment of utility bills and foundation correspondence when my fingers brushed against a harsh, cheap expanse of coarse white paper. My hand stopped moving. The return address in the upper left corner was stamped in a stark, unfeeling black ink, Federal Bureau of Prisons. Beneath it was his inmate identification number. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the front of the envelope, my eyes fixing on the handwriting spelling out my name and new address. I remembered Marcus's handwriting. It used to be a bold, slashing script, the arrogant signature of a man who commanded boardrooms and casually signed away hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the script staring back at me was utterly unrecognizable. It was frail, trembling, and erratic, the ink pressing too hard in some places and barely scratching the surface in others. It was the desperate scrawl of an old, broken man. A heavy, sickening dread pooled in my stomach. Every rational instinct I possessed screamed at me to walk directly to the trash chute at the end of the hall and drop the unopened envelope into the darkness. I owed him absolutely nothing. I had survived the wreckage he had caused. I had no obligation to read whatever pathetic, manipulative pleas he had managed to cobble together from a prison cell. And yet, an invisible, magnetic gravity pulled at my hands. I carried the letter upstairs, placing it on the kitchen island like a live explosive. I stared at it for an hour as the afternoon sun shifted across the floorboards. Against my better judgment, against every promise I had made to myself, I reached for a kitchen knife and sliced the envelope open. The letter was written on 2 sheets of lined, yellow legal paper. I sat down at my bay window, the city buzzing obliviously below me, and forced my eyes to focus on the trembling words. There were no greetings, no manipulative attempts at small talk or demands for forgiveness. The letter began with a brutal, bleeding admission. "I am not writing to ask for your mercy because I know I do not deserve it," the first line read. "I am writing because the silence in the cell is deafening, and every time I close my eyes I see her. I see Grace, and I see what I actually am." He didn't try to justify the stolen money or the tropical vacations. Instead, he stripped away the arrogant, playboy facade that had fueled my vengeance, exposing the rotting, pathetic core beneath it. He confessed that he hadn't sought out Lily because he was bored of our marriage, or because he felt trapped by domestic life. He had run because he was a profound, irredeemable coward. He wrote about the sheer, paralyzing terror that gripped his throat every time he walked into Grace's hospital room and saw the dark, bruised circles under her fading eyes. He couldn't stomach the reality of his own utter helplessness. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling outcomes, bullying his way to success, and manipulating the world to suit his needs. But he could not negotiate with pediatric cancer. He could not bribe death. "I looked at our dying daughter, and I felt nothing but weakness," he wrote, the pen digging so deeply into the paper it had nearly torn through. "So I ran to a world where I was still powerful. I bought expensive dinners and diamond bracelets because it made me feel like I was still a god, instead of a pathetic, failing father who couldn't save his own child. Lily was an anesthetic. I was a coward running from a burning house, and I locked the door behind me, leaving you to burn alone." Tears stung the corners of my eyes, blurring the yellow paper. But it wasn't the confession of his cowardice that stopped my breath. It was the paragraph on the second page. A paragraph that seized my lungs and violently tilted the axis of my entire world. "There is something else," the shaky script continued. "Something I took to my cell, hoping the guilt would eventually kill me. 3 months before Grace passed, Dr. Aris pulled me aside in the hallway while you were sleeping in the chair next to her bed. He told me about a new, highly aggressive experimental immunotherapy trial opening in Switzerland. It wasn't covered by any insurance. It would have required liquidating everything we owned, and the statistical chance of success was agonizingly low. My hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled in the quiet room. I told him not to wake you. I told him we wouldn't pursue it. I told him I wouldn't subject Grace to the pain of traveling halfway across the world just to fail, and I wouldn't subject you to the devastating, inevitable heartbreak of false hope. But that was a lie. I didn't hide it to protect you. I hid it because I was already exhausted. I had already checked out. I couldn't bear the thought of extending the nightmare, of dragging out the timeline of my own discomfort. I played God because I was too weak to keep fighting. I stole her final fraction of a chance because I wanted my suffering, to be over. The letter slipped from my numb fingers, fluttering gently to the hardwood floor. A profound, ringing silence engulfed my apartment. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. An experimental trial, a chance, however infinitesimally small, however statistically improbable, there had been a door left cracked open, and Marcus had quietly, unilaterally slammed it shut and locked it. He hadn't just abandoned us. He had actively curated her death to expedite his tropical escape. He had sentenced her. A guttural, agonizing sound tore its way up my throat, a sound born of a pain so deep it felt prehistoric. I doubled over in the chair, clutching my stomach as a violent wave of nausea rolled through me. The cold, diamond-hard vengeance that had sustained me during his trial was entirely gone, replaced by a messy, blinding, suffocating mixture of rage and toxic guilt. The what-ifs began to swarm my mind like a hive of furious wasps. What if I had been awake? What if I had checked Dr. Eris's chart myself? If I had known, I would have sold my own organs on the black market. I would have carried her to Switzerland on my back. I would have fought until the flesh was stripped from my bones. I looked down at the discarded yellow paper resting on the floor. I had spent the last year viewing Marcus as an evil, calculating mastermind, a brilliant corporate sociopath who had orchestrated a grand, devastating betrayal. But looking at the trembling ink, the truth settled over me like a heavy, suffocating shroud. He wasn't a mastermind. He was just a small, terrified, fragile little man. He was a pathetic creature who had let his own daughter die because he didn't possess the spine to watch her fight. The beautiful, sunlit sanctuary I had built around myself suddenly felt like a fragile illusion. The peace I had so desperately fought to secure was entirely shattered, ground into dust by the trembling handwriting of a ghost. I closed my eyes, the tears hot and fast against my cheeks, realizing with a terrifying certainty that my war with Marcus Vance was not over. The legal system had punished the embezzler, but the coward who had stolen my daughter's final hope was still breathing. And I needed to look him in the eye one last time. The drive to the federal penitentiary took 4 grueling hours, a monotonous ribbon of gray asphalt that cut through a desolate, frozen landscape perfectly mirroring the cold resolve settling in my chest. The letter sat on the passenger seat, folded into a tight, sharp square, a physical anchor to the horrifying revelation that had dragged me out of my safe, sunlit sanctuary. I drove with the radio off, the silence inside the cabin heavy and absolute. For a year, I had convinced myself that I had successfully severed every tether binding me to Marcus Vance. I had dismantled his life, sold our shared history, and built a monument to our daughter's memory in the form of a thriving foundation. But the knowledge that he had actively concealed an experimental treatment, that he had played God with Grace's fading life purely to expedite his own escape, was a jagged, poison hook buried deep in my flesh. I could not simply throw the letter away and pretend it didn't exist. To truly survive, to ensure that the ghost of his cowardice didn't haunt the rest of my days, I needed to look the monster directly in the eye one final time. I needed to witness the ruin I had orchestrated, not from the detached safety of a courtroom gallery, but face to face, separated only by an inch of bulletproof glass. The federal facility loomed on the horizon like a brutalist concrete fortress against the overcast sky. It was a sterile, oppressive monument to human failure, surrounded by towering fences coiled with razor wire. I parked my car in the visitor's lot, the biting winter wind whipping through my coat as I walked toward the heavily fortified entrance. The intake process was a degrading, mechanical choreography of metal detectors, pat-downs, and heavily stamped paperwork. I moved through the checkpoints with a numbed, clinical detachment, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. A towering, unsmiling guard escorted me down a maze of echoing, fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled sharply of bleach and stale sweat. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind us with a terrifying, rhythmic finality, locking me deeper inside the belly of the beast. Finally, I was led into a narrow, suffocating visitation room lined with individual booths. I took a seat on the cold metal stool in booth number 7, staring at the thick, smudged pane of plexiglass separating me from the inmate's side. A heavy, black plastic telephone receiver hung on the wall to my right. I folded my hands on the shallow counter and waited, my heart beating a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. When the heavy metal door on the opposite side of the glass finally groaned open, the breath violently hitched in my throat. I had spent the entire drive bracing myself to face the arrogant, polished corporate titan I had destroyed, or perhaps the desperate, sobbing mess I had left on the floor of our vacation home. But the man shuffling into the sterile booth was neither of those things. Marcus was entirely unrecognizable. The impeccably tailored linen shirts and expensive, sun-kissed tan had been replaced by a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off a sharply emaciated frame. He was a hollow, gaunt shell of the man who had once commanded boardrooms. His cheekbones jutted out sharply against his pale, translucent skin, his hair was thinning and heavily streaked with coarse gray, and his eyes, once sharp, vibrant, and full of predatory confidence, were sunken, bruised, and entirely vacant. He looked 20 years older, a walking, breathing ghost completely crushed beneath the unbearable weight of his own profound sins. He sat down slowly, his hands trembling violently as he reached out to grasp the black receiver on his side of the partition. I picked up my own phone, pressing the cold plastic to my ear. The line hummed with a hollow, metallic static. "You came." His voice crackled through the earpiece, raspy, weak, and entirely stripped of its former rich resonance. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "I didn't think you would ever come. I read your letter, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level, betraying absolutely none of the violent emotional storm that had raged inside me days ago. I needed to see the man who decided my daughter's life was an inconvenience. He flinched, closing his eyes tightly, as if I had driven a physical blade into his chest. A single, pathetic tear leaked out, tracking slowly down the deep grooves of his gaunt face. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking, a desperate, breathless plea echoing through the wire. "I am so incredibly, unspeakably sorry. I know the money doesn't matter. I know the affair was just a symptom of my own disgusting weakness. But hiding the treatment, stealing her final chance, it is eating me alive. Every single time I close my eyes in that cell, I see her. I see Grace reaching out for me from that hospital bed, and then I see your face when you realized I wasn't there. The nightmares never stop. They are drowning me. Please, I just need you to know that I never wanted to hurt her. I was just so terrified of the pain. I was a coward. Please, I am begging you for forgiveness. I just need a sliver of peace." He pressed his free hand against the thick, smudged glass, his shoulders shaking with silent, wretched sobs. I sat perfectly still, staring at his trembling fingers pressed against the barrier. I waited for the familiar, blinding flash of rage to ignite in my blood. I waited for the primal, feral urge to scream at him, to batter my fists against the glass and curse him to the darkest depths of hell for what he had stolen from my little girl. I had spent over a year fueled by a diamond-hard, unyielding hatred. But as I looked at the pathetic, weeping, broken creature cowering on the other side of the glass, a profound and startling silence settled over my soul. The rage simply wasn't there. The fire had entirely burned itself out. Looking at Marcus Vance, I didn't see an evil mastermind or a cruel, calculating villain. I saw exactly what he was, a profoundly weak, profoundly small man who had entirely destroyed his own universe because he lacked the fundamental courage to love someone more than he loved himself. My chest expanded, drawing in a long, deep breath of the sterile prison air, and a vast, quiet, oceanic pity washed over me. He was going to spend the rest of his miserable life trapped in a cinderblock cell, tormented by the inescapable ghosts of his own catastrophic cowardice. His punishment was absolute, eternal, and entirely self-inflicted. He didn't have the power to hurt me anymore. He was entirely insignificant. "I don't know if I will ever be capable of forgiving you for what you did to her, Marcus," I said softly, my voice calm, steady, and ringing with absolute finality. "And I cannot grant you the peace you are begging for. The nightmares you have are the only things you have left to keep you company. You earned them. They belong to you now." He looked up, his sunken, bloodshot eyes widening in desperate, suffocating panic as he realized the absolute finality of my words. "Please," he choked out, his voice a pathetic, fading rasp. "Please, don't leave me like this." "I am not leaving you," I replied, a gentle, untouchable calm settling deeply into my bones. "I am letting you go." Without waiting for another word, without a single lingering ounce of hesitation, I placed the heavy black receiver firmly back onto its metal cradle. The metallic click severed the connection, cutting off his weeping pleas entirely. I stood up, smoothing the front of my coat, and turned my back on the glass booth. I didn't look over my shoulder as I walked out the heavy steel doors. I walked down the fluorescent corridors, through the security checkpoints, and pushed through the heavy front doors of the penitentiary. I stepped out into the biting winter air, the pale afternoon sun breaking through the heavy cloud cover, casting a brilliant, golden light across the frozen landscape. I took a deep, freezing breath, my lungs expanding fully for the first time in years. The tether was permanently cut. The ghost was dead. I walked toward my car, leaving the ruins entirely behind me, feeling, at long last, truly undeniably free. The passage of time, once a cruel and agonizing reminder of everything I had lost, eventually transformed into a gentle, flowing river that carried me toward a profound and unexpected horizon. When I walked away from that federal penitentiary, leaving Marcus entirely behind the thick pane of bulletproof glass, I didn't just leave a broken man. I left the heavy, suffocating armor of my own survival. The bitter, freezing winter that had gripped my soul for over 2 years finally gave way to a brilliant, unyielding spring. My sunlit apartment no longer felt like a mere refuge from the wreckage of my past, but a vibrant, breathing headquarters for a future I was finally ready to embrace. The Grace Foundation, born from the darkest ashes of my grief, began to grow with a staggering, miraculous momentum. What had started as a fierce, localized initiative to pay medical bills and provide emotional support for a handful of families rapidly evolved into something much larger than I had ever dared to dream. The true turning point, the moment the universe seemed to definitively validate our mission, arrived in the form of a 7-year-old boy named Jonah. Jonah had been battling a rare, aggressive form of pediatric leukemia, and his mother, Erica, had come to us entirely depleted, her spirit fractured by the relentless, bureaucratic cruelty of insurance denials. Jonah needed an experimental bone marrow transplant, a cutting-edge procedure his providers deemed out of network and prohibitively expensive. It was the exact kind of devastating, terrifying crossroad Marcus had cowardly hidden from me. But this time I held the pen. The foundation stepped in with absolute, unwavering force, entirely funding the procedure, the out-of-state travel logistics, and the specialized aftercare. We held Erica's hand through the agonizing, breathless weeks of waiting. And then, the miracle arrived. Jonah's body accepted the transplant. He went into full, unprecedented remission. When Erica called me, her voice entirely broken by soaring, hysterical tears of absolute joy, I sat on the floor of my office and wept with her. It was a cleansing, triumphant flood of emotion. We had done it. We had snatched a child back from the precipice. Grace's legacy had physically saved a life. Jonah's miraculous recovery became a catalyst, catching the attention of national news outlets and pediatric advocacy networks. Almost overnight, the Grace Foundation was catapulted onto the national stage. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing us to open satellite branches in major cities, expanding our reach to thousands of terrified families standing exactly where I had once stood. I found myself traveling, no longer running from ghosts, but running toward the light. I stood on massive, brightly lit auditorium stages, looking out at seas of hundreds of faces, donors, doctors, and surviving families. Gripping the microphone, I shared my daughter's story, but I no longer spoke of her as a tragic victim of a cruel illness or a casualty of her father's monstrous betrayal. I spoke of her radiant, unyielding spirit. I shared the bell-like sound of her laughter, the fierce way she loved the world, and the immense, transformative power of her memory. Standing in those spotlights, bathed in the applause and the tears of strangers, I reframed her narrative. Grace was not a tragedy. She was a brilliant, enduring beacon of hope that was systematically changing the world. The most profound manifestation of this healing did not happen on a national stage or in a corporate boardroom, but on a quiet, sun-drenched Tuesday afternoon in early summer. The foundation had recently funded the complete construction of an inclusive, accessible playground in a vibrant city park, a place designed for children of all physical abilities to experience the pure, unadulterated joy of simply being a child. I attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing back as the gates were finally opened. The air was instantly filled with the cacophony of shrieking laughter, the rhythmic squeak of the swings, and the rapid thud of small shoes running across the soft rubber pavement. Near the entrance, set into a beautifully landscaped garden of bright wildflowers, sat a solid bronze plaque catching the afternoon sun. It read, "In loving memory of Grace, a light that shines forever." I walked over to a quiet wooden bench beneath the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree and sat down, letting the golden warmth of the sun wash over my face. I closed my eyes, listening to the symphony of joy echoing across the park. For so long, the sound of children playing had been a jagged knife to my heart, a cruel reminder of the future that had been stolen from me. But today, the sound was a soothing balm. It was the sound of my daughter's legacy breathing, living, and thriving in the world. A sudden, Soft rustling nearby pulled me from my reverie. I opened my eyes to find a little girl standing just a few feet away. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with a wild halo of dark curly hair and cheeks flushed pink from running. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress, remarkably similar to the one Grace used to wear when she spun in our backyard sprinklers. The little girl looked at me with wide, earnest brown eyes, holding her small hand outstretched. Gripped tightly in her tiny fingers was a single, brightly colored dandelion she had plucked from the edge of the grass. "This is for you," she chirped, her voice sweet and entirely devoid of hesitation. I leaned forward, a profound, breathless awe swelling in my chest, and gently took the flower from her hand. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "It is absolutely beautiful." The little girl offered a brilliant, missing tooth smile before turning on her heel and sprinting back toward the slide, her laughter trailing behind her like a bright ribbon. I sat perfectly still, holding the simple yellow weed against my chest. A warm, gentle breeze swept through the park, rustling the oak leaves above me and brushing softly against my cheeks. In that exact moment, surrounded by the golden light and the ringing joy of the playground, I felt her. I felt Grace. She wasn't confined to a cold cemetery plot or trapped in the agonizing memories of a hospital room. She was entirely present, woven into the sunlight, the wind, and the undeniable beauty of the world she had helped me rebuild. That evening, the city below my apartment window was painted in breathtaking strokes of violet and bruised orange as the sun finally dipped below the skyline. The apartment was deeply quiet, but it was no longer the oppressive, echoing silence of an empty life. It was a comfortable, peaceful stillness. I walked over to the antique oak desk, sitting in the alcove of my bay window. Neatly stacked on the corner were the foundation's expansion plans, next to the vintage manual camera I now used to capture the everyday magic of my new life. I pulled out the chair and sat down, resting my hands lightly on the smooth wood. Positioned perfectly in the center of the desk was a silver-framed photograph of Grace. It was my favorite picture of her, taken on a beach long before the illness, her face alight with an ecstatic, gap-toothed smile, her eyes sparkling with infinite mischief. I looked at her, truly looking at the radiant joy captured in the frame, and a soft, genuine smile stretched across my own face. The crushing weight I had carried for years, the debilitating grief, the toxic, all-consuming vengeance, the paralyzing fear of moving forward, had finally been set down. The war was over, and I had emerged from the ashes not as a fractured survivor, but as a whole, fiercely alive woman. Marcus's cowardice and betrayal were nothing more than a dark, insignificant footnote in a story that was ultimately defined by triumphant, enduring love. I picked up a sleek, silver pen, pulling a fresh, leather-bound notebook toward the center of the desk. I opened it to the very first page, the crisp white paper completely blank and full of magnificent, terrifying promise. I took a deep, steadying breath, my lungs expanding fully with the crisp evening air, realizing with absolute, unshakable certainty that I was no longer just surviving. I was finally, truly living. I looked at the photograph of my beautiful girl one last time, my heart beating with a steady, powerful rhythm, entirely ready to write the beautiful, unwritten chapters of my future. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Time is the most precious thing we have, and I am deeply humbled that you chose to spend yours listening to this story. Life can sometimes deal us the heaviest of blows, and betrayal by those we trust most can leave us in the darkest of places. But as this story shows, no matter how deep the ashes, there is always a way to rebuild, reclaim your power, and find your light again. Whatever storm you might be facing right now, please remember, you are so much stronger than your hardest days. I would be truly honored to hear your thoughts. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had to find the courage to start over after the unthinkable? Please leave a comment below. This community is a safe space, and your words or shared experiences might be the exact motivation someone else needs to read today to keep going. If this journey touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge. Your support means the absolute world to me, and it allows us to continue exploring the raw, honest, and powerful stories that connect us all. Thank you again for watching. Stay strong, keep moving forward, and I'll see you in the next video.